Hello everyone, welcome to Social Work 3110, Oppression, Diversity, and Social Justice. This week's teaching assistant is Lucky. Lucky is a foster kitten that I am currently looking after. She's a bit hyper, so I doubt she's going to stay with us. Okay, let's get started. So far we've learned about what social justice is and what its goals are. So the central goal of social justice is to redistribute the rights, duties, and resources more fairly within society so that everyone has guaranteed human rights and the opportunity for social participation. And one of the ways that we do that is through critical reflection. So we have to engage in reflective thinking to overcome the acceptance of taken for granted assumptions or so-called facts and stop accepting them at their face value. So we engage in a critical consciousness where we challenge the explanations for why things are the way they are. So this is known also as praxis. It's the practice of witnessing, reflecting, and engaging in critical dialogue about the causes of dehumanization and challenging structured inequalities. And a lot of those inequalities are the result of the colonization process, right? So the imposition of European and Western ways of thinking and knowing and doing upon others. So we need to decolonize our ways of knowing and being and doing and try and look at things from alternate perspectives. It's going to be very uncomfortable at times because you have to recognize that you have helped to perpetuate oppression, either unintentionally or unconsciously, but just by nature of the privileges that you have power over others. You need to recognize that. And the way that we do that is through dialogue, research, and self-reflection. These are just some of the ways that the textbook lists, but they're the key ones that I wanted to focus on. For me, the most important is research. So we want to know why things are the way they are, and the way we can do that is by looking at numbers and quantifying the problem. That can help others engage in critical thinking as well and challenge their accepted facts. So if we can show and prove with numbers that yes, Black individuals are more likely to be incarcerated regardless of the crime that they commit compared to white individuals, or that Black individuals will have a lower salary regardless of their level of education and years of experience compared to white individuals. Then we can start to deconstruct these accepted norms and facts that Black individuals just commit more crime or they don't work as hard, and start to develop policies and practices that actually promote, Black advancement within work and ensuring equal pay for equal work. So you'll remember these from last week and the week before, the 5 perspectives on distributive justice. I want to just take a moment for a second to examine one of these terms in here that we sometimes take for granted, and that's human rights. So you might think that you know what human rights are, just the basic rights that each individual should have. But there's a historical context that we need to be aware of here in order to have any discussion about human rights. So human rights were codified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the United Nations in 1948. And what it features is 30 articles detailing an individual's basic rights and fundamental freedoms as inherent, inalienable, and applicable to all human beings. So what that means is that they are essential and that they're unable to be taken away. So you can't remove somebody's human rights without committing a crime. And the picture here is actually of Eleanor Roosevelt. She was key in getting the United States to accept these human rights articles. There was a lot of pushback internally within the US in the reluctance to accept these human rights. Some of the rights were judged to interfere with parental rights, such as the right to be free from violence. It was felt in the US that that interfered with parents' rights to punish their children using corporal punishment. The right to life, of course, is not in keeping with the capital punishment that we still have in the US. So the United States, unfortunately, was not a leader in getting human rights accepted internationally, which is, as I said, unfortunate because this declaration, while itself not legally binding, it served as the foundational document for several covenants and conventions, which themselves are legally binding. So the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which guarantees individuals civil and political rights, such as the right to vote and to choose their representatives. The Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, so the right to have a job, the right to not be discriminated at your place of employment or within society. And then there's also specific ones, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the Rights of the Child. It's very important to note that the United States, at every step of the development of these covenants and conventions, fought to water down the language. And even despite getting significant compromises on the part of the United Nations, the United States still has not signed the majority of these covenants or conventions. Or pardon me, they've signed them, but they haven't ratified them, which means that they're not legally obligated to follow them. The US is literally the only country in the world that has not signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is it's very concerning, obviously. The US is seen as a progressive country, as a fighter for human rights. However, on the international and global political end, we are very much not meeting this image. The other thing that we should note is that we're only one of 5 countries, including Iran, not to have ratified the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So what all of this basically means is that in other countries who have ratified these agreements, individuals can take their own country to the International Court of Justice and basically charge them with violating their human rights. And then the International Court of Justice can impose sanctions upon the country. And because the US hasn't ratified these agreements, that's not possible here. So within other countries, including Brazil and Canada, the country has been taken to court by individuals and that has allowed for human rights progress in these countries, which unfortunately has not been seen here. So I hope you'll take from this that human rights, while is something great to aspire to within the United States at least, there's always been a lot of pushback and very little political action on it. So how do we support human rights in a country that doesn't legally recognize them? The first thing I would recommend you do is you educate yourself on the political decision-making process here in the US. Stay informed of what policies are being considered and push for policies that are in line with human rights legislation. The first document within the US that meets the modern definition of human rights is the American Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. However, as we've seen through the various amendments that have been introduced over the years, there's a lot missing from that, including the still yet to be passed Equal Rights Amendment that gives equal rights to men and women. We still have not passed that amendment. And there's also issues where some amendments within our Constitution are directly opposed to the human rights of others, such as, for instance, the right to bear arms. So we, of course, have heard many arguments that this is an individual right, and if it's infringed upon, we're infringing upon individual human rights. However, we also have to consider that the other human rights being infringed upon with this amendment is the right to live. So because we don't have this international legal framework that we can turn to within the US, instead the Supreme Court is the one that determines the scope of human rights in the US. For instance, we're seeing that right now with the arguments pro and against women's right to medical services, or as some people call it, the fight over abortion, but really it is a right to medical services. And we've seen it in the past with the right to marriage for same-sex couples. The Supreme Court is actually the one that is able to uphold or dismantle these human rights. So that's why we need to be advocates, first on an international scale, for the US to ratify these international declarations and treaties so that we can be put to account by other countries, and so that we can hold our own country to account at the International Court of Justice. We should also advocate for the inclusion of human rights principles in national laws and policies, and we need to address human rights violations within and by the US, and we see a lot of that against migrant workers, refugees, prison population, and of course against people of color through voter suppression tactics. So all of that takes us right back to oppression. So human rights violations are often the result of oppressions based on difference. So these are done through the construction of difference and the cycles of socialization. So we are socialized to see our experience as the norm, while the members of other groups are exposed to socializing experiences that are marginalizing or devaluing. And in that respect, the cycle perpetuates itself. I'll give you an example from my own childhood. So I'm very much dating myself here, but when Peter Pan, the Disney movie, first came out, I was having a conversation with my siblings about who would you want to marry from the cast of characters. Keep in mind, we're children between the ages of 6 and 9. And I said I wanted to marry the mermaids because, you know, they're gorgeous and they're way more interesting than stupid Peter Pan or any of the others. And I was immediately told, no, you're a girl. You can't marry another girl. You have to pick a boy. So that's heteronormative socialization occurring from a very young age. And we're all exposed to these, whether it's heteronormative, sexist, racist cycles of socialization that teach us a specific way of thinking and that shape our positionality or our social context. So these oppressions are a systemic form of domination, and they remove the right and access to resources that everybody should be entitled to, either by silencing people, as in the case of how I was told that no, I could not marry a girl, or through direct forms of violence. And what we need to do is recognize that there's an interplay of oppression and privilege, and you can think of it as two sides of the same coin, which I'll show you in a second. But part of it will entail recognizing that we live within the United States in a society that very much is based on white supremacy. So I know that's going to be uncomfortable for some of you to hear and come to terms with. However, this is, as we can see from the numbers and the disparities within our society, very much one of those truths that we need to come to terms with. So this is the coin model of inequality I just mentioned. So privilege is on one side of the coin, oppression is on the other. And the coin itself is the social structure that produces and maintains inequality. So sexism, racism, ableism. If you're on top of the coin, you have advantages others don't. You didn't earn these advantages, you have it because of who you happen to be. So you happen to be born, for instance, white, or you happen to be born without any physical or mental disabilities. On the bottom of the coin, you have systems, oppression. So you have disadvantages, others don't. You didn't earn these disadvantages, you didn't do anything to cause them. You have it because of who you happen to be, how you happen to be born, the environment you were born in. And unfortunately, unless those in the privileged position are willing to flip the coin and remove some of these social structures that maintain inequality, the oppressions will continue. So let's look at privilege in a little bit more detail. So we examined this last session with the power flower. However, as I mentioned, very few things are black and white or dichotomous, right? For instance, taking the case of skin color and racism, it's very much socially constructed, right? What is considered white and what is considered black is socially constructed based on where you are. So what is a mixed race person? Are they black or are they white? It's going to depend on where they are and who they're around. So this diagram here shows the more nuanced way that we can understand privilege within our society. And I'd just like to take a second to talk about privilege within social work. So all of you are students here studying social work. The fact that you are able to go to university to study social work means that you are privileged. You're getting a formal education, which will result in a well-paying job. So there's almost 800,000 social workers in the US, but it's a predominantly female led profession. So it's about 80% women, 20% men. If we take the binary description of sex, which we really shouldn't, but current government statistics don't go further than that, unfortunately. In general, social work is actually quite diverse as a profession. It is very similar to the racial breakdown of the United States demographic, so about 60% white, 20% black, 10% Hispanic, but we continue to have a discrepancy in wages. So female social workers continue to earn on average $2,000 less a year than male social workers. Male and white social workers are most likely to be promoted to supervisory or managerial positions where, of course, there's the higher income. And black female social workers are the ones who are least likely to be promoted, and they end up, of course, with the lower salaries. So even within our profession where we strive for social justice, we see that we are not free from engaging in this structural inequality and perpetuating these oppressions based on privilege. Another way of understanding privilege is through the theory of intersectionality. So the authors went into this a little bit. It was started by Crenshaw, and she used it to conceptualize how oppressions aren't additive. Instead, your race, sex, your ability, they very much interact with each other to influence what oppressions you experience and what privileges you have. So always think about your areas of oppression and your areas of privilege. You will always have both. So make sure you recognize both of those aspects. Don't think you have only ever experienced oppression. If you look for it, there are areas of privilege. As I mentioned, you're in school pursuing a degree. That's at least one area of privilege that you have. One of the ways that oppression is furthered is through the so-called cycle of oppression, where misinformation is accepted as truth. So this could be stereotypes or negative perceptions. They further systematic mistreatment and justify it, which is then reinforced through institutional policies and practices and has real consequences in people's lives. So we can consider how the perpetuation of misinformation supports the existence of white supremacy. I would encourage you to watch John Oliver's video on Tucker Carlson. So it does a very good in-depth analysis of how certain media sources use misinformation to feed the narrative that white supremacy does not exist in the United States. Keep in mind, this is a late night HBO comedian, so the language is definitely not suitable for children. However, it does a very good job of explaining just how misinformation can be spread and encouraged to be perceived as the truth. Last thing I want to cover is microaggressions. So these are indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group. We've all engaged in them, unfortunately. There's something as simple as complimenting somebody to say, you speak excellent English, without realizing they have lived in the United States their entire lives, just based on their appearance. Or having thoughts such as everyone can succeed if you just work hard enough, because that doesn't recognize the structural barriers that different people experience. These can be based on one's gender, sexual orientation, race, class. There's many ways that microaggressions are unfortunately perpetuated. If you've committed a microaggression, sincerely apologize and avoid repeating it. If you see a microaggression being committed, speak up. And this is most important when you hear somebody say, you're not like the others, or it was just a joke. That's my own personal favorite microaggression. Call those people out. It is not just a joke. It is perpetuating very harmful stereotypes and thoughts about another group. I've noticed that if you ask somebody to explain why it's a joke, then they really lose steam and pull back from the conversation, if not full on question themselves. And lastly, I will cover the 5 faces of oppression. So this is what we're going to use this week to examine oppression within our own lives and within the systems within which we work. So the 5 faces of oppression were developed by Iris Marion Young, and they are exploitation, which is the denial of social and economic value of one's paid and unpaid labor. So what that means is, say, unfair wages or unsafe working conditions. It also includes what's known as the second shift. So this is described very well in a book called Second Shift, but it basically means that women, once they finish their paid labor, go home and begin a second shift where they're responsible for care of the home, caregiving of children and older relatives, cooking, cleaning, etc. Unpaid labor that's not recognized financially, but is expected of them. We also talk about marginalization. So this is the creation of second-class citizens by social, political, or economic exclusion, and this results in severe material deprivation. We also have powerlessness, which is the denial of access to resources and the right to participate, politically especially. And we see that through voter suppression tactics, such as strict ID requirements, the purging of voter rolls and kicking people off the voting rolls, and gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is where you basically draw the political map, the voting district, based on ways that benefit political parties as opposed to the residents. I strongly encourage you to look up gerrymandering and to find out more about it, because through gerrymandering, politicians basically select their voters instead of voters selecting their politicians. It's a big concern. Fourth, we've got cultural imperialism, which is the imposition of dominant groups' worldview. We discussed that earlier. It marks other cultures as different or deviant. And lastly, we've got violence. This is a systematic violation, both physical and structural. And this is where those microaggressions also fit in. And this is things like attacks or reigns of terror or just humiliation of the targeted group. And we see that with prisoners, for instance. In some prisons, they're forced to wear pink uniforms as a way to dehumanize them, which very much draws parallels to Nazi Germany, where certain groups of prisoners were forced to wear pink as a way to identify them as deviant, and usually that was the gay men were forced to wear pink to show that they weren't masculine enough within these concentration camps. So quite concerning that we're seeing this in the United States.